Right. All right. Welcome, everyone. I apologize for the delay. We had some weather delays. We had 60 some people online, so I'm just going to give everybody a second to come in and then we'll get started. We have we've got half a dozen people here in the room of the Yale Club. For those of you in New York, we'd love to have you in person. We're starting to do these monthly again on a hybrid basis. If you can be in the city, can join us. We'd love to have you every time. We'll get started. And I see the numbers slowing down a little bit. So this is being recorded. So for those who are interested or missed the program, obviously we'll be able to share it. We also do an audio podcast version to be able to watch it. So thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us for a Yana evening tea program. For those of you who are undergraduates, remember this is based on what used to be called master's teas. The colleges, I believe, are now called head of college or head of school teas, where you have sort of fireside chats with leading experts who are alumni. And this evening, I'm delighted to have with me David Van Zandt, who is a law school graduate from 1981. He was the longest serving and most strategic dean of Northwestern Pritzker School of Law from 1995 to 2010, and then with equal vision brought that to the new school here in New York as president from 2011 till recently 2020, where he transformed those institutions' approach to their forms of education. Prior to his academic leadership roles, David was a professor at Northwestern Law. He was an attorney at Davis Polk, and he was also law clerk to the Honorable Harry Blackmun at the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as law clerk to Honorable Pierre Leval, U.S. District Court, and now he's still senior judge, I believe, for the Second Circuit.
It's hard to believe he's senior already on the Second.
I checked, he's still there, yeah, Second Circuit, and also a lecturer. So David received his A.B. summa cum laude in sociology from Princeton, a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a JD from Yale University, which is why we got him here, where he was the managing editor of the Yale Law Journal. He's the author of numerous legal articles and many presentations about all sorts of things in education. And he also is the author of a book called Living in the Children of God, which we're going to talk about a little bit, based on his doctoral dissertation about the time he spent living embedded with a radical religious group in England and Netherlands. So welcome, David. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. So we're gonna, I think you're probably most known for your strategic planning with Northwestern and maybe in those kind of business and leadership. But before you started your legal studies, I mean, you engaged in a really interesting kind of sociological ethnographic research project for your PhD, where you were embedded, I understand, both covertly and overtly. I just finished reading the book. So now I may remember more details than you do. In what was kind of a cult religious group at the time in the 70s called the Children of God. I don't know if people remember about that. And you ended up being in England and in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. So I'm just curious, like, where did that idea and the project come from? And what was that experience like, if you can remember? I mean, this is well before like your whole legal career.
Actually, it's one of those things, it gets emblazoned in your memory.
Yeah.
I've forgotten lots of stuff that happened since then till today, but excuse me. I got interested in that. I was an undergraduate at Princeton, and I just got interested in sociology and religion, in a whole bunch of different. I myself am never particularly religious. So I grew up in a liberal Protestant family. But I got interested then, and frankly, I was head of the law school when I was a senior at Princeton. But I had this fabulous professor from the London School of Economics who somewhat tricked me. He said, well, you can come to the London School of Economics and finish your PhD in 2 years. Which, compared to, and then I sort of looked at some other sociology PhD programs around the country in Berkeley, because they're all very, 6, 7 people still doing it, as far as I know.
Yes.
And so it's a lark. And then I said, okay, I'll go. And then that was probably November. In January, I get this letter from the London School of Economics saying, oh, well, we look forward to seeing you here. What's your dissertation topic? And, I knew somewhat the area I wanted to be in, and I actually run across the Children of God here down in Greenwich Village in probably 1974, 75. And I remember rainy night just like tonight at the same. temperature, and they tried to recruit me or to get me to come. They ran discos or something back then, and I had heard about them because they had been big in Time magazine and other places. They were the first group that was subject of deprogramming. Because one of the members of the group happened to be the daughter of the attorney, a person in the Attorney General's Department in California's Attorney General's office, who came up with this idea. He wanted to arrest his daughter, and he got some people to deprogram her. I don't know if that one ever worked out, but that was sort of their notoriety. I mean, they were known for, a total commitment group. You gave up all your assets. They would show up if you decided to join. They would show up at your house or apartment and collect everything of value they could find. And so I said, "Oh, that's intriguing." I've always sort of been interested in the way ideology impacts sort of everyday life of members of groups like that, or people generally. And I said, okay, so I wrote that down. Well, when I showed up in London, end of September, early October that year, I walk around in the sociology book. Oh, that's the guy who's doing this show. My gosh. So I was sort of locked in, but it turned out to be a great project, because I wanted to understand how ideology impacted everyday life. I figured I'd have to go live with it for a while. There was a professor, full professor, not at LC, but up at the University of Stirling, who had a grant from the Social Science Research Council in Britain to study them. And I said, I went to see him, and he said, well, the only way you're going to do what you're going to do is live with it, but you'll never get in. They won't let you in. So me, by being naive, I said, well, let's see if I can get in. So I went to one of their discos in London. Went a couple times, and they were trying to recruit me, and I said, okay. Finally, I thought at some point, I said, okay, I'm ready to go. And it turned out they sent me up to what they call colonies up in Bradford, in the Midlands of England, which were, fairly depressed. London was not in great shape at that time, but the Midlands were even more depressed. And they had a house. They rented a whole house. There was about 25 cult members or group members in that house. I don't think we had any children at the time, but it was, people basically my age. And I said, okay, ready to go. And what I didn't realize when I first started this, and nobody told me, was they actually spend 6 days a week, 8 to 10 hours on public streets. In this case, it would be like shopping malls and shopping districts. Some would go to train stations, basically trying to recruit people. And they did that. They would have these letters that were sort of the written theology of their founder, called Mode letters. His name was Moses David. It was a very sort of counterculture kind of thing. And so you go up to somebody and then say, I'm from the Church of God, would you read this? Yes, you believe in Jesus, so forth. But basically it was a money collecting place. A few people would, I have some estimates how many people would actually end up being recruited, but not that many people were actually fit for the group, because you had to be young, you had to be a certain psychological type. And so it was very difficult to do, but I did it for almost a month in total. And you always had a minder, you always went in pairs. The idea to protect each other from the horrible outside world that come get you.
The system.
The system. Yeah, there you go. That's the term, the system. And after after a while, I just was not sleeping there. It's tough. Basically, I was misrepresenting myself. It's something, frankly, I couldn't get away with today because of human study.
You were representing yourself both to the children of God and this to people in the street. You said you were having some troubles, really kind of living with.
Right. I have great admiration for the undercover police officers and spies who can do that day in day out. So I finally said I can't do this anymore. So actually there was one, like a 4-day period where I actually left. I went down to London, and a psychiatrist who worked at the LSE gave me sleeping pills.
Yeah.
To go back to it. So finally, the fear was that if you left the group, they would try to keep you from leaving the group, because the reputation was, I think it was not correct, but was that they would hold people by physical force. Not to say it never happened, but I was sort of, so what I had done when I first left is I had this very complicated signaling arrangement I set up with my roommates in London, as well as my parents. So if you got this particular, I knew you could write postcards.
Right.
So if you got this particular postcard that said X, Y, and Z, you're authorized to come.
Be a great spy. I mean, like,
Come and get me. And we had to make arrangements. They didn't want them taking my stuff out of my apartment. So,
right.
although they never showed up. Come on in.
Hi, Victoria, is this the Yale?
Yes.
Yes, you come.
Don't worry, come join us.
Thank you.
And and this is probably, I should stop here, but when I went to tell the leader of the group that I wanted to leave, there was a great deal of psychological pressure. If I had been a believer, it would have been fairly effective, because he basically saying, I understand why, I understand it's hard here, but you have to, you came here because you didn't like the system, you weren't happy, and now you're going to go back to that, and things aren't going to be any better. And it seems persuasive argument to somebody who had bought into the belief system at the time, but they didn't put me in handcuffs or and then later I was able to, because I had done that, I had some credibility, because I had done that and not written an expose in a newspaper about them. I had some credibility with some of the leaders in the group. I had an intermediary put me together with them, and they then let me do it open.
Did you go back to the same people?
No.
What happened? Did you ever be in touch with folks that you started out being in covert? Like, what did they do or say or think once they found out you were sort of an imposter?
Yeah, I ended up seeing one in Europe, that on the continent afterwards, and he was, sort of grinned. He was, they were just happy I was in there, because they thought I would do an objective study and present them to in a positive light. They also were hoping I lived with them for an extended period, I would join them as well. No, they didn't. Nobody was angry at me for having done the undercover thing. They actually thought it gave me credibility.
So, how did that experience? You're recalling a lot of details, and having just read the book, it's like it's very fresh in my mind. So
It's fresh in my mind too.
Yeah, that was my question, is sort of like, how did that experience, if it did, kind of influence, the rest of your life in kind of decision making or thinking how you interact with people? One of the things that you had noted when, the anxiety maybe you were going through with having to do the witnessing on the street, and then having to present a different self, undercover self, and then having to roll distance for sort of, like, have you ever had to utilize some of those same skills, or think about what from that experience did you take with you, other than just the memory of it? Any skills or thoughts or nuanced learning and how to interact with
I was applying sort of an anthropological ethnographic method, and part of that is in very old style anthropology, you would go live with a group that was considered a primitive group of some sort, and you had to learn a language and you had to fit in, and I think that enabled me in a lot of different situations, whether ranging from being on a law faculty to working with donors who I don't necessarily share the same background with, but it gave me some facility and being able to talk to people. And, not that I couldn't gotten it some other way, but I think that's helped a lot. Trying to understand what somebody else is thinking and how they're thinking about something is actually a very useful thing. And it's there's actually interesting at law schools a tendency to do the other thing, to tend to think that you know the answer and they're going to help somebody and
get the right answer. Right?
Yeah, force it on somebody. And not to say I didn't fall into that at times, but it's I thought it was particularly on law faculty, it was very useful being a dean to have that skill set.
Did you think about, after that experience, staying in sociology or academia, or do you mentioned you thought you were going to law school anyway?
Yeah, I gave it some thought. I did a couple part-time teaching gigs, but it was very, back then it was very difficult to get a tenure-line job, and it was, it's worse today, right, in social science. And also I realized I probably didn't want to do one thing for my entire life. Which, if you're really going to be a dedicated research-oriented academic, you really have to do different projects, but you're in one sort of lifestyle, and something a lifelong commitment. And I thought at least being a lawyer was just a little more variety to that.
So you went to Yale Law School. What was it like then? I mean, what did you think, if you think back on what it was like now, and maybe, other than what you were able to implement at Northwestern, do you think legal education or law school, maybe Yale particularly, I don't know how in touch with that you are, has changed since then?
Yeah, I can tell you how it's different from Northwestern 10 years ago, but I'm sure it's probably not that much different than it is today. You had a tremendous faculty, world-renowned faculty. I think there was a tendency there, which we didn't really have as much in Northwestern, to think that each faculty member thought every student they had should be a professor like them. And the reality is not many people ended up doing that. And I think for some people that created a bit. But the fabulous part of the law school, actually, you have students. I met people from all over the country. I mean, I had a couple of classmates who wanted to be the next Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton hadn't been there yet. And then you had people coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, wanting to do different things, and they ended up doing very different things, from elected positions to. I've got a friend who was at the UAW board, chief lawyer for a while. All sorts of. Another friend was a municipal bond underwriter. So people just went and did all sorts of different things, and they were just a great group of people. Very smart, obviously, but I thought a good group of people.
And then you went on a pretty traditional, I would say, high prestige academic or at least legal pathway after that, right? So judicial clerkships going all the way up to the Supreme Court. And then, a little bit of the Wall Street law firm.
Yeah.
Well, did you think about that? Or was it sort of like you're on the track? You just kind of, were you thinking you wanted to be a litigator, or you wanted to be a judge, or you were just, that was the next highest thing to go to?
I think there's a bit of that, quite a bit of that. I never wanted to be a litigator. So that was never the attraction of law to me. It was a court case. Actually, my wife is a former U.S. attorney, so we're different. She's a litigator, and the reasonable person. I tell her all the time. I don't take extreme positions, but but other than that, it was, I think it was part of the treadmill, in the sense that in a place like Yale Law School, I did well. And I think the expected next step was to do clerkship. And the expected next step was to be a professor like the professors you had at Yale. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do that, because it's not really open. I mean, clerkships are open to most people, but even that day, maybe being a professor.
And what was the value maybe you took out of those kinds of clerkships, and maybe even a little bit of the private law firm job before you landed at Northwestern as a professor? Well,
I put together, which is I'm very interested, a district court clerkship and a Supreme Court clerkship. So
skip the circuit.
Right, a trial sort of, we are doing litigation at the time, and then the appellate of the Supreme Court. I found particularly the trial with Judge Leval, because basically he was on the bench all day long, and we were responsible for dealing with all the pre-trial cases and all the summary judgment, things that are not going to be resolved in trial, sorts of cases. And so you dealt with a whole bunch of, and you had to deal with people. So you saw people coming in which you don't, in appellate court, you don't have to. Right. You don't see people. So you'd see the kinds of problems that people got into, both personal and commercial, right? So from Wall Street, I mean, when I just went to Davis Polk, great experience having seen a number of litigations over covenants and insurance policies and bonds. So that was a great part. And then going to the Supreme Court is just a different, coming out from a different. I also had two different experiences. Judge Leval at the time, I was probably 28, 29. He was 44. Recently on the bench. He was very young, and he would, when he wasn't sitting on the bench, he'd have you in his office. He'd talk about all the cases in great detail, and you go argue about them back and forth. Then you go out to dinner in Chinatown. So it was a great experience that way. And when I went to Supreme Court, Justice Blackmun at the time was 78. very wonderful man, a very different kind of person, but his style was, he would have breakfast with the clerks at 8 a.m. in the court cafeteria. But then he'd go into his office and you were expected to write memos or draft an opinion and sort of almost put them under the door. And it was very rare. He would actually come out and he would very rarely interact with you orally or verbally on the It was always by review. You know, he would write comments on the drafts and get done, I'd ask a question or something like that. Yeah, it was a completely different experience. He was a wonderful human being and a wonderful person, and you know, enjoyed being as I did with Judge Leval.
And from that, those experiences, you said a little bit, seeing the translating what you did on the district court into the corporate world. What about what you were taking from the Supreme Court experience, maybe into the academia or just general thinking, and what else had been happening? Just, it was an interesting, you know, you're getting working on high level cases and stuff. I mean, anything that kind of stayed with you out of that experience?
You know, I never wanted to be a constitutional lawyer.
Okay.
And you know, most law professors start out wanting to be constitutional lawyers. I wanted to be more of a commercial lawyer, so I started teaching property, and I taught a business associations class, and I also taught a seminar based upon my research, not social religion, but more on sociology. So I can't, you know, from the court, I mean, again, I met a lot of great people there, and can't say it drove me to do it.
So you were on the faculty before you came to, like 10 years, you
10
said?
years, yeah.
About 10 years. How did you know you wanted to have an administrative kind of a leadership role at law school?
No, I wouldn't have crossed my mind when I started.
So how did it come
The
about?
law faculty tend to think of the dean as sort of evil.
Yes.
So, yeah, and I was part of the law faculty, so.
Yeah.
You know, I did it, frankly, I taught for 10 years, I really enjoyed it, but going back to what I said before, like being a professor of sociology for your whole life, I didn't realize I didn't want to be a law professor. So actually at the time that the deanship came open, after I'd been there 10 years, I was actually looking outside.
In legal practice or something else?
Well, I skipped part of it. When I was at Davis Polk, I actually met a family from Belgium who wanted to do some investment in the US. So I helped them out and I continued to work for them on the side through my entire career.
Okay.
And now, you know, in 2020, I joined them full time in their office, which is, you know, it's a completely parallel life going on, things. And but I really enjoyed that part of it.
Did you like the teaching with the students more or less than, I presume you had to do the publish or parent, like you were writing articles as well? How did you find that kind of tension or balance?
You know, you know, teaching, I love teaching with students. Preparing was fun. I also like doing some of the research, not all of it. And I also knew, I think it was more a question of not liking something, or maybe I didn't like either enough to say I'm going to spend my next 40, 50 years doing it.
So in the deanship position, did somebody encourage you to do it? Like what made you decide, oh, I can see myself doing that?
Actually, one member of the search committee, they were looking for me. It was hard to find because we had a very notorious faculty in terms of conflict. And so it was a little hard to find somebody from outside to come in and take the job, even though that was their first choice. In fact, they offered the job to 2 other people before they offered it to me. I was on the only 3 on the last list. So. I was the last one standing, so I took the job. But that, you know, that turned out to be partly because I realized I did want to try to help lead something or manage something. My dad was a small businessman, you know, and so I sort of had some of those tendencies as well. To do something like he did, and you know, law school is for any academic institution it's not a business, but it's got a lot of things for business. And one of my great advantages there was that I had a much deeper commercial business culture, you know, experience than anyone, because most of the people up there in Clerk, they become straight from the clerkship or the appellate clerkship into law school. So the only thing they knew was litigation, or they may have worked for a year or 2 in a firm, but again, they were always doing litigation. I was doing transaction for a short time as I did. So that actually gave me an advantage. because I was willing to say, let's just look at this strategically from a, you know, I have some other organization that I was running, and we had certain goals for it. Well, how do you get from here to there? And the goals are very different in academic institutions, but they require that you do this efficiently. They require that you focus on strategy. You can't have people going in 100 different directions. And so that was, you know, what I tried to apply. I early on developed a close friendship, mentorship relationship with a guy named Don Jacobs, who's the dean of the Kellogg.
Yeah.
And he had been the one before I became dean of law school. Right, started as dean in the late '70s. You know, really moved Kellogg, and we just sort of also ran business school to Business Week, at least #1 for a while. And those rankings. So, and you know, he was attracting very good students, I thought.
Did you know him while you were a professor, or did you sort of seek him out when you became?
I met him at the very end of my time as professor, because there was a alum, actually there was a father of 3 guys who were JD MBA students at about the time that I was teaching there. And the father was very upset, as were they, because they thought Kellogg and law school didn't work together at all. Well, it's a 4-year program. He spent 1 year, 2 years at the law school, and then maybe a couple of years at Kellogg, and he came back for the 3rd, 4th, 5th year business of law school. So the father was very upset about that, and that's when he called a meeting. The father was the CEO of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange at the time. So he called a meeting downtown in Chicago and put us all in a room thinking
All the deans, or the deans of the 2?
Well,
and the president?
It was 2 deans plus some faculty.
Okay.
Came along. I was one of those people. That's sort of my area. And they didn't get along. The dean of the law school that I succeeded didn't like the dean of Kellogg, and vice versa. Right. So it explained why we didn't weren't able to do anything together. But I was, you know, I thought he'd done a great job, so I just tried to learn from him what he'd done, and that's how at Northwestern we introduced a couple of things. One is by the end of my time, we were interviewing every student. That was actually interesting in the law school world. That was sort of something we didn't, because I think it came from the fact that 1, they only cared about the LSAT, but 2, they could also make an argument how it's discriminatory. That is, you know, to interview somebody. Right, and certainly there's a lot of truth to that. You go back historically, but it doesn't mean an interview in itself is bad. And I also took the view that practicing law or being a lawyer is a service business. Basically, you have to understand people's problems. You have to understand being a technically great lawyer is fine, but there are not many people who can make a long-term living on that. You really have to have some ability to understand problems. I used to tell my law students all the time, nobody comes to you because they have a legal problem. They come to you because they have a personal problem or a business problem that they need to have solved, that has a legal aspect of legal. And I think a good lawyer always finds themselves not just being a lawyer, but being, you know, our business advisor. Sometimes it's going to be a therapist, sometimes, right? My sister ended up being a lawyer practicing outside of Philadelphia in a family practice. And the story she would tell about the therapy side of it. Yeah, quite amazing. Quite amazing.
So it sounds like, so you obviously had this business experience during kind of working on your own, and then having family, and then connecting with the business school team, because I was going to say, like, they certainly don't teach you how to be, maybe after what you implemented in Northwestern, but team building, leadership skills, strategic management. You don't learn that in law school. Maybe some do now, and I gather you don't learn that in PhD, you know, science programs. And so it's just interesting. I was curious, kind of like, well, how did you figure it out? Like, you sort of started right away, pretty quickly, right? With some strategic plans. You did 2, right? In the 90s, and they were pretty successful. Yeah. And that came from generally just kind of applying what you, I guess, the common sense application. It's almost like what you did or what you observed in Children of God. Like, maybe you have this ideology of how things could be done efficiently, knowing your clients, understanding problem solving, but it's got to be applied in a kind of a common sense, practical way. Did you think about that consciously as you were?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, we started with admission. So one was interviewing. The other aspect was we began only taking people with work experience. least a couple of years ago. When we first started out, you know, we worked down at the Chipotle for, you know, part-time, that was enough. But by the time I left, you really had to have at least 2 years of substantial full-time work experience, preferably not in a law firm, less and less. We don't want paralegals because you can do that for the rest of your life. We want you to either be in a business or a nonprofit where you got to the point where you led a team or a project, and had a level of responsibility, which after, you know, for most kids coming out of college, after a year, the first couple months, obviously, what you started is getting used to it, but after a year, you begin to get your feet on the ground. And then the people running an organization realize that you can do some things and they would give you assignments. And that was the kind of person that we were looking for through the missions process. Then within the curriculum itself, yeah, we introduced a lot of the team building stuff. We did
Quantitative.
we tried to, you know, that's a tougher road to hoe because one, the faculty thinks they have a much bigger role to play in the curriculum, and that wasn't what they did. They studied con law, so why not do that? But you know, between Kellogg and us, we were able to put a lot of things in for just the regular JD students. Then the other thing was the JD MBA program, which got converted with Don's help to a 3-year integrated program. So you could complete both degrees in 3 years, and we talked to each other. You know, we had it worked really well. I always said, you know, if you're going to go, if you would never, it never ended up more than maybe 20% of our class was in that program, but that was a gigantic number compared to other universities. And I always used to wonder, I said, you know, tell us, do you want to go to law school? You're going to spend 3 years of your life in law school. Right? Why wouldn't you get a trade degree if you can do it in 3 years? Basically the same amount of money. But people don't think that way. People get in their minds, I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm not going to do business. Same way I'm not going to be a doctor. You know, and so why would I do anything? And I think a lot of lawyers later in their career realize they probably would have benefited from doing it. But you only learn that later in life. It's hard to convince a young, very eager person that maybe she do things.
And then you also did an accelerated JD program, right? So
Yeah.
How successful was that? I mean, I remember I wrote, I think, poetry for one of my 3rd year, you know, exams, because I was just done. I already had, you know, and I thought, what a waste this whole year has been.
Yeah, what's based on that? That is such. You know, I can't say it wasn't as successful as I hoped it'd be. You know, we maybe at a time would have 20 people in a class, or maybe I think at 30, we had 30 at one point. And again, you're looking for people with more work experience, so they would tend to have 3 to 5 years of substantial work experience. They were a fabulous group of people, but you know, it never really took off. It really the way I sort of expected it to. So you have to try things. You try things, you don't try things. And then finally, after I left, got killed by the American Bar Association.
I was going to say the ABA was sort of in the backyard. Did you have notorious organizations, but did you have like pushes with them or trying to get talks to? I mean, I know I was on the career placement side. There was a lot of stuff we were sort of stuck under because of, and a lot of people were stuck under because. Did you find the needle move at all? Some things you were able to do in Northwestern? Was there an effort to try to get the ABA along with some of these things? I mean,
they were what a horrible institution, but they were no offense to anybody. I remember they did lots of great things, but the part of legal education, right, is a very ingrained, inbred group of people who had a very traditional view of what legal education was, and so we battled that at the time. The biggest battles, frankly, were over we started. In our JD MBA program, we would accept either the LSAT or the MCAT, GMAT, right? And that just like released. So we actually got called. Or the other thing we did, was the ABA had lots of rules about job security for individuals in the organization, which no other accrediting body that I'm aware of. There may be one other, sorry, they don't dictate that you have to complete certain contracts that come work in your organization. So I actually hired a law librarian who didn't have tenure at the law school, which was not good. And then I began hiring a number of people in our clinic who were full-time people, great people who just, they tended to be, people for whom tenure is not a big deal. They didn't want tenure. And so, by the time I left, we had at the law school, we had some 50 or 60 people in on tenure line, but full-time teachers. And we kept the tenure part, which sort of had to people doing the cutting edge research. But when you kept the number down, it meant you didn't get a lot of people who got life tenure but then didn't do any more research. So the ABA did not like that. So we got called to come out to they first said you got to change this. We said no. And we told them why. And then we finally got called out to San Diego for a meeting of the section, at which it was like we got a show cause order. And they sent it to my president too. And why? Because this is on the tenure issue. I think tenure for librarians and clinicians. Why we shouldn't be de-accredited because we didn't follow this rule. I thought it was crazy. My president was apoplectic. Not that the impact on he was just, why are these people doing this? They're interfering with academic freedom. And so he and I went out, we hired Kirkland and Ellis, their antitrust lawyers, and went out. We put on a big enough show, so they backed off. They later, I don't think that issue ever came up again. The LSAT one did later on, and I think finally they killed the 2-year program by regulation. And then the JDMBA, I'm not sure where it stands right now, but they made us do the LSAT too after my time. After my time,
it's a regular self-regulated industry, and talking about other kind of strongholds on the industry that's not even a regulating agency, the US News and the rankings system. And what was it like to work under that? How was that affecting what was going on at the law school? And I guess there's now a move now that a lot of the top schools are Harvard and Yale, I guess, and others are bowing out.
Well, I have a fairly contrarian view, I expect on that. I actually didn't think it's such a bad thing. I think providing information for people is important, and US News gave you some information of some sort. And I thought it was fairly condescending for us to say to very successful college graduates that you're not bright enough to cull through this information, figure out what's good for you. So I actually, I was fairly supportive. I would have changed some of the way they did it and some of those things. But I thought it was embarrassing for the law schools and law teams to get on their high horse about how we can't be judged. We can't be judged by them. And there were more. One thing I also did encourage was multiple rankings. So we actually pushed a lot of other people to come up with quite a few rankings. In the business school world at the time, probably 7 or 8 different rankings, all having different, algorithms or ways of calculating. And, so Kellogg might be number 1 in one, but number 10 in something else, in Wall Street Journal. So I thought, if you had a multitude of raters, that would be good. And there were some that started at that time. But I think the weight of the establishment in new education and finally worked out. It's nice that Yale thinks they don't need the US News, but
we'll see.
It doesn't change what people think of Yale. Yale's still, number 1.
For the branded schools,
the brand's good.
may not matter much, but
they can walk away from it. But it did make a difference for lower tier schools, and there were some 200 law schools in the country being ranked, and it made a big difference in your admissions if you're ranked. You move 10 places in terms of what we did.
So what was the biggest challenges you faced while, as dean at the law school?
Well, early on, it was just trying to repair with the culture that was pretty bad. And then generally it was generally trying to get things organized. Working with the faculty, and there were some faculty allies who really believe in this stuff. So some who didn't. I mean, one of the other things I did do, which is a bit contrary again to legal education, I basically said for the research positions, I didn't. I thought we should get people who actually had some research skills, usually through a PhD of some sort in some discipline. Usually, time law schools had a lot of philosophy PhDs or political theory PhDs, but they had a few economists around them, sort of pushed off to the side, except at the University of Chicago, and then they really wouldn't have good. I sort of said, well, let's go. And by the time I left, we were, I think, 75% of the researchers, tenure on faculty, which is a little less than 40 had PhDs. And again, I got a lot of criticism from other, including some people here, about that kind of matter. So that was another issue that we had problems with. I had the great fortune of having president of the University Administration, not just the dean of the business school, but also the president of the provost, who were all bought in. They wanted to see change. They actually arrived. Law school was ranked 15th or something. One of the first things they said to me is, "Yeah, let's get it up. Let's get it higher." And so once I didn't have a choice, unfortunately, I agreed with that was something. I always say, if you were doing the things you need to do to provide a great education, a useful education to students, the ratings ultimately take care of themselves. But you shouldn't be fighting.
So you were reporting directly and had a good relationship with your provost and your president were the main ones. And then, so it sounds like you had a very good run there, because I don't want to move this on. And then you went and took on this position at the new school. What led to that? Did you think, like, I think I've done my run here, it's time to look for something else, or was it an opportunity?
Yeah, I got done with my run. I think at Northwestern, it was time to look for something else. Yeah, this is this track.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, ending up in university presidency. Maybe I could have been one sort of traditional university, but frankly, it wasn't all that attractive because those jobs at the top schools are mostly about fundraising. And today they're really horrible because they're about fundraising and keeping the place from blowing up all the time. So that wasn't, I've always thought about that was a builder, organization, leader, strategy. I wanted to have an institution I could do something.
Right.
And so the new school, I thought that was a good institution thing that really, people didn't know it. I didn't know at the time that Parsons School of Design which is the best in the world, it was at the time, was the most significant part of the new school. People saw the new school from all sorts of different angles. We're talking about the elephant in the blind. Some people in New York City know it because of TV.
I know. A lot of courses there.
And then there are people who know Manus, which is the classical music school, if they're in that world. There were people in the city government who knew it from Milano, which is sort of a public policy program. People who went to Parsons didn't know they were at the new school, basically. They would never say they were at the new school because they were at Parsons. So I thought the idea was that, particularly undergraduate, because we could see it in law, we could see it in other areas that, incomes were, separation were incomes. The people who had more education, but also who were more creative, ended up with making more money. And if you really want to be successful in the world today, not in money sense, but just making a contribution, you had to have a level of creativity. And I thought that a student who could mix both, because we had a fairly strong liberal arts, humanities, and social science program. So the other part of the tradition, the oldest part of the school was, well, first continuing that with social science PhD programs. And I thought if you put that together with Parsons, the education of Parsons, you would produce some very good students. And the students who came to Parsons were by far the best students in the university in terms of just traditional measures like SATs and grade points. And they actually were treated by the rest of the university as being sort of formula, these are just artists of fashion design. They're nobody there, but but once you put them into the classes, got them into classes with more traditional students, they realized they're very sharp. Some of them took to it, others, there were certain people, Parsons, who said, why would I take, a literature course? I came here to do fashion design. But most of them, weren't that way. And Parsons also had a very successful program called management, design and management, which really put you really forced you to be more in the liberal arts and social science by the university. And those kids ended up doing by far the best, coming out and just jobs. So that was the general concept there. And I think we made there were a lot of things to repair at the new school, more so than Northwestern, because I arrived just after Senator Bob Pierre, and Bob's a wonderful. I love Bob, he's very helpful to me, but he had gotten himself into a lot of hot water at the new school, including some big strikes, and occupations of the building. He had all sorts of problems, but he lasted 10 years. But there was a real conflict between the administration and the faculty, and then the students, of course, were doing the faculty side. Who had to talk to the students. And so we had to somehow fix that.
I was going to say, I'm coming from Northwestern, when you're dealing with, well, you're under the aegis of a bigger university. It's a very focused graduate group, and you're sort of with tenure, and I gather the governance structures like other law schools where it's faculty governed for the most part. There's so much. And now
He also plays sure that's actually true.
okay. Actually covered. All right, then you come to the new school, which is it intrigued you. There's clearly work to be done. Totally, I would imagine, different kind of student population. You're now only not only dealing with faculty and students and stuff, but now you're reporting to a board of trustees. What was that like? I mean, both the dealing with the kind of student body, which I gather you said, I think by your own admission, did not know a whole lot about art and design and those kind of things. And I gather from a corporate standpoint, must have been somewhat familiar with that kind of corporate, with the governance trustee, but actually being unanswerable to a group. What was that like with that relationship, maybe with the students first, and then kind of the relationship on the governance?
The student, it was great for almost all my time there. That was, it felt like, it's a bigger student body, so you didn't really get to know as many people, a higher percentage of people you could at the law school. But I felt at least that was a pretty good relationship over time. The faculty were, I was a breath of fresh air in some sense, although, at the end, after 10 years, sort of some wore out. I wore out my welcome some. And the board of trustees, it's very interesting. The new school's got a very difficult problem because the board of trustees, first of all, there were so many octogenarians on the board of trustees. It's been there forever. They were wonderful people, but they'd also been there forever. And they also had joined the board for personal reasons. None of them were alumni. I, in fact, had so many, probably many in this group, at the Yale Club and the Harvard Club, because the trustees were all graduates of those places. And they didn't want to come downtown to have a meeting, so we would meet here. They'd had these jobs, these positions for a long time. Quite a few of them were connected somehow to the university in exile. So, how many of you know that this new school for social research brought in over 100 academics from Europe who've been chased out by the Nazis, both Germany, Austria, later France, and gave them a home. And that was, at the time, they were mostly Jewish. And at the time, if you were Jewish, even though you were a spectacular scholar, Harvard was only going to take one or two. We're not going to take a whole cohort of people of that religion into their faculty. So the new school had this fabulous history of the university in exile. And not most, but a fair number of the trustees, particularly the older ones, that was their connection to the school. It was the new school for social research. And it was University in exile. They weren't alumni, but they just supported. Yeah, that resonated with them, and and they would have trouble as the school changed. They tended to run Parsons, not everyone, but their Parsons is sort of the trade school. we had to run because it produced money to keep the rest of them afloat. You know, they were there for a long time. In fact, I just looked at the list of trustees. I've been going now 3 years. My predecessor, my successor said, "Oh, we're going to change something." Well, it's the same people.
I was gonna say, did you manage up a little bit trying to sort of accept it, or did you try to get some pipelines? And I mean, we have a lot of nonprofits obviously in our community, but a lot of people
Yeah.
face the sort of founders, you know, still there, the original board. So I was just curious, how did you address that? Did you just?
Finding allies in the board.
Mhm.
You know, I brought in a chair after my first year who was more of a Parsons connected person,
Mhm.
because there was really very few people on the board who actually had a connection. And that helped a lot. He helped that. Basically, he took care of the more difficult issues at the board level when I ran the university. And that was a very good partnership.
And how was the fundraising? I mean, was that something you said that, you know, at the time you didn't want traditional stuff, but I presume it's part of the, you know, president's job, or were there other ways you got people to step up for that?
Fundraising, we tried very hard. And that, of course, that was a high priority of the board because they all went to Harvard, Yale, and they thought that's what a president does. And we tried very hard. We ultimately got up probably to about 40 million a year now. Region Yale. But you realize that's next to nothing on a $300 and $400 million operating budget. That is not going to set a job anymore. I mean, maybe we had 5% of our revenue coming from endowment, and we had endowment when I started about 300. Again, we got it up to 450, but that's not going to move the needle for replacing 10,000 students. And the problem was, one, the board didn't. They gave money to very specific thing. Most of them actually didn't have money, which I was shocked. The second problem was the new school by the programs it had just was not producing people who made any money. You know, you had a social science school that was producing PhDs. You had Alano, which is sending people into the public sector. You had Parsons, which was, you know, artists tend to make a lot of money. A couple of fashion designers will make a fair amount, and some other people that are capable end up in business and do well, but there wasn't really a deep well to go to. In fact, it turned out at the end, our biggest donors were parents of Parsons kids from China. So I spent a fair amount of my last 5 years, or the second 5 years, visiting people in China, and that did generate the money we did get. That came from China. But it's a very different world than a Harvard or Yale or Princeton.
Or even law school where you don't, I mean, did you have to do much fundraising? I mean, that was.
Oh, yeah, you
did, okay.
do a lot of, fundraising, but there was easier because one, you were going to alumni who had money,
Right.
and who, for the most part, loved their experience and enjoyed having a visit from the dean. It was much easier. Our university was well organized already. My president came from Princeton, so he knew how to set up fundraising.
They're always the lit, right? They're always the shining star for the other universities. Well, I have other sort of general questions, but I wanted to take a pause. Yeah, and just see if anybody from the audience had questions. And those online, if you want to send something in chat, let me know. Ken, anyone?
Yeah, David, I had a question. This whole Supreme Court decision on affirmative action is going to be coming up, and just would love to get your opinion on, how, if you were dean now at a law school, how you would handle that, and what can be done to, if that decision comes through as the way we think it will, what can we do?
The Michigan, what was the name? The Michigan decision came out when I was, what we did, what the law school did, what the deans did, a fair number of law schools was actually paid a lot of money, got a good brief written and submitted that, and trying to make public statements about it. I think today, I think the reality is it's going to happen. I'm shocked it would be about private schools. I don't know how they're going to make that happen. I understand the state schools, that's sort of easy. That's an easy one for the court, but how are they going to tell Harvard they can't do this or that, except by making a reverse discrimination argument, which is what the plaintiffs in the Harvard case are saying. So I think that, that is probably ground which you can knock out private, affirmative action in private schools, if you can actually find that happening. So I think it's really gonna, I think all you can do as a dean or a president, once that happens, is go back and say, you're always gonna keep your eye on the makeup of the class, but you're gonna, certainly not be very explicit about it. You may do, I mean, like UCLA and Texas, University of Texas said these, which had some success. And frankly, if we all had to move to that system, then you're dealing with that wrong. But I think it's inevitable. I don't really have a good answer. Frankly, I look at the cases, particularly the one at Harvard. I say, I think there's something going on there. I think there really is something going on there, which is not good. But it's a intractable. I think it's really intractable part that I'm not sure what we're going to do. So I don't have an answer.
Other questions in the room? Or anybody online? Go ahead.
Pretty much the point that a lot of the current university presidents, they not only they have to worry about fundraising, but also have to worry about, just keeping the school from blowing up. I'm just curious, like your view on the current political climate, maybe for campuses around the country, especially in my leagues. I feel obviously most colleges students can be very progressive. That's totally understandable. But I feel like I go back to college for my union 5 year, 10 year, 15, I feel it's getting, the climate is like continuously shifted towards the left. It did create a lot of trouble for Yale College university.
I would not be one of the president's holiday.
Yeah.
Sitting in my house with students around.
Yeah.
That's nice.
So I was curious if you have any advice for the current university presidents, how they should deal with that, or maybe you think, well, this is an issue that not really for university, but it's like broader in society, and there's really not much university alone can do about it.
Yeah, I mean, new school is probably at one extreme of that, because the great advantage I had at the new school is nobody who was conservative would attend or think they could come speak. And nobody at the school invites someone that's conservative to speak. That was a blessing. That was a blessing in disguise. But I think it's terrible for intellectual development of students. And I'm afraid that it's in one sense it's like a religious help type organization. You put a bunch of kids together at a young age who are passionate. That's a great thing to be passionate about things and the people who are willing to be aggressive about pushing their views tend to win out. Most people will stay quiet in those environments. The faculty, sure it's true other with the new school, the faculty they were either competing to be the champion of the students, to appear as a champion of the students, or they were cowering in their offices. And frankly, once that happens, there's not a whole lot the president can do. But it is, and again, it makes great cannon fodder. I mean, great fodder for people like Ron DeSantis, to those arguments. We had critical research. A lot of, if I could, you could always pick out of the writings things that were pretty outrageous. So I don't have an answer of how it's going to. At the universities, I think it's going to take some very tough-minded boards and presidents, and the reality is they aren't there. There may be some tough-minded board members, there may be some tough-minded presidents, but the reality is a board is a terrible way to run an organization, a non-profit organization, because nobody has, they're there for is to keep money, and nobody has a real stake. It's better if they're alumni, so they care about their school, the university, what happened to it. But most nonprofit boards, they're yeah, one of the people, but they're saying, well, do I really want to be the person who's on the board when, you know, something blows up, something horrible happens? In fact, that was the attitude of my board, was just make it go away. You know, I don't want you to do what you have to do, whether it's agree to outrageous demands by the union, do what some students wanted for the codes. That was the reaction. And again, I don't blame them, because they're in a situation where it's a no-win situation for them. If things go on. So it's so I think we're in a difficult time in countries when, you know, and again, a lot of politicians on both, you know, more on the right, but certainly on both sides, are playing off these divides. You know, it's very easy to do what some of the Republicans are doing, and creating straw men, actually, in many cases, to knock down. But when you say it to somebody, it's just sort of minding their own business. Oh my God, that is horrible. You're gonna get some political traction for that. I think maybe it's when our politicians in Washington go on. Maybe that's when, you know, we might have some hope for the tenor of the rest. It is based on being a sociologist. It is based on, there's some realities. There's the realities of, again, back to what I was talking about, you know, Parsons, if you're better educated, your life chances are getting better and better. The jobs, the blue collar jobs that are unionized or be high paid are fewer and fewer. And so there is this dispersion. It's much easier for politicians, particularly populist politicians, of both stripes, to play off that and take advantage of that. And that's something that, you know, I mean, more kids need education, you know, higher, more educations they can get and training they can get, and you know, we need more open immigration policies, in my view. And so, because we're not going to grow unless we bring more people into the country. But I mean, that's not my specialty. Anybody can sort of say these sorts of things.
Well, it's been a couple of years now. You've been out for a few years. I don't know if you're still following, but it seems like there are people just saying to heck with us, and right, they're starting things like University of Austin and there's Heterodox Academy. And
Yeah.
kind of, you know, people are leaving some of these institutions and saying we just don't see the balance ever going to show up, and maybe that'll work, maybe it won't. But I'm just curious to know, like, what do you think the future is for higher education, or maybe what it should be? But the reality is, what do you think? What is it going to look like? What's it going to be? Do you think in a couple of years?
Well, I think the economic pressures are such that there'll be a group of 150 or so universities and colleges that'll be just like they are, because they have big endowments or they have a brand that people will pay tons of money. You got to remember, there's 3,000 to 4,000 four-year college and university. I think it's 3,000 private, so there'd be more if you had the public. That's a lot of institutions competing, and I think there are quite a few that are struggling right now to fill their classes. And unfortunately, they all follow a very traditional model of small class sizes,
A lot of administrative support.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the big push in the cost side actually is that it's demand for services that students and their parents have, and it's sort of a varied standard industrial organization, you know, economic problem. That is, you have a very fragmented industry, and the only way people really can't compete on price that much because they have fixed cost structures that can't change. So the only way to do it is by keep adding bells and whistles. When airlines used to have fixed fares, the way they competed was having a better service on such and such. Not today, but you know, they're not fixed anymore. So I think you're going to see quite a few smaller places go out of business. It's already started.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're losing 30 to sort of small colleges around the country here. You're going to have to see move away from the very traditional model of, you know, a college campus, full-time residents, small classes, high level, you know, research faculty. You have to move away from that, and if you're going to educate the number of people we have to in this country, so you're going to see more see more, certainly more online, that's really picked up. There's some, obviously, there's some negative things about that, but I always thought that, in fact, I tried very hard to build a much bigger workplace like Southern New Hampshire University to build incredible online programs to reach more people than could, the traditional model can use to. So you're going to see a lot more of that happening. People are going to learn in different ways. And there was a period where maybe 10 years ago, people were very keen on tech boot camps. Peter Thiel was doing something here. But I think you're going to see people pick up education that way. And just today, if you in the health industry, if you can learn something about tech, be a technician, you're doing pretty well. You can have a pretty good lifestyle. You train yourself, get trained on complex methods. We're going to need more people. We're going to need more and more people. So I think colleges, they'll just be forced to change. People cannot pay 50, 70,000 a year to send their kids home. And it's a problem because anybody who's middle or upper middle class, they probably either had that experience or aspire to have had that experience. But you got to remember that system was set up before but in the US in the Revolutionary period. And it was, the big schools, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, were all basically finishing schools for the wealthy. The male signs of the wealthy is they could learn Greek and they could learn this. It wasn't as geared, well, it's geared to the economy at the time, but it wasn't as geared to what we have today. And so it's not obvious that 4 years in residence, it's a wonderful experience. It's a great growing up experience, but it's not obvious from an educational standpoint. That's a desirable or even effective efficient way of educating a large portion of the population.
Things to think about. All right, well, we're definitely at the end of our time, so I want to close maybe just with a couple of just general questions. Your biggest influencer over the course of your career?
There certainly were some professors early on who really pushed me at Princeton, and then one or two, and then certainly my Don Jacobs, biggest influences on my later professional career. Henry Bean, who was the president at the time, is also, I'm still in touch with him, going holidays, but those are probably some things. There's some amazing academics out there. I had a great deal of admiration for that inspired me. Well, we could do something, could we? And the institution really do have a very positive contribution to make society.
What are you reading these days?
I tend not to read fiction. So I like to read history things. I just finished something on the Revolutionary War Amendments by Eric Foner, Columbia historian, which is great. What was it? I'm reading right now a book on the mission to Pluto and everything that went into putting that together. And, sort of like science stuff.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, David, thank you for joining us. We hope if we get any follow-up questions, we can be in touch.
Oh,
but
sure.
I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and thoughts with
Yeah.
us, and I know our audience really appreciate it.
Well,
So,
cool. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, and if you want to hang around for
yeah, please hang
few
on. All right,
minutes,
for those online, let me just make sure we didn't miss anybody online. There we go.
you see something.
I have one question. Let's see. You mentioned a trend towards online courses, and this person said she was a student during the onset of COVID confinement. It was clear that a lot of professors were totally unprepared for the transition. How do you think staff could be better prepared for these kind of traditional faculty, maybe unless we need new schools to do this, could be better prepared to that new style of learning, perhaps, or consuming education?
There's some training and some schools do a good job. They did a good job of training people. Others basically did it the way teaching's always done at universities, law schools, which is, do it by trial, basically. I mean, nobody ever told me how to teach. And there was any training to start teaching also, and I notice it's true for the most part of universities. Yeah, I think that's something we're just going to live through. I lived through it because my wife is a professor who spoke at Liberal Arts College, and she had to do all her courses online. And she would write about it, but then after a while, she actually began to see some of the advantages. Because there's many things go in the classroom, or that people do that are frankly done better, any lecture is done better online. You know, why? I once made, I was at a higher ed conference in Madrid, and I made a comment, something like, I said, I don't understand why the University of Nebraska has a 400-person hall, where they teach introductory chemistry taught by, some local faculty. I said everybody would be much better off if we basically had a Harvard professor in that who's very good. I just, he said, there's nothing going on in the classroom that is value added to what's happening. And the Financial Times picked it up, and it was a little sort of squid, and I got a call or an email. It was an email from the chairman of the Department of Chemistry. And he said, you really should, before you shoot your mouth off, you should really learn your facts. In Nebraska, our introductory courses are limited to 200 kids.
I've heard discussions about, like, wouldn't it be more efficient for people to take the best academics in any given in fact, even in law, right? It's a standard curriculum
Right.
for the first, 2 years at least, or there's set 8 courses maybe. Why do we have 200 different law schools all teaching the same thing?
Right.
Could there be a more efficient way to do that, right? You've got so-and-so is the best, civil procedure professor from Harvard, and you've got a business person from Northwestern, Chicago. Has that been proposed or anything? Like, have you thought,
Well, not at the major school, nobody.
nobody wants to do it.
Well, it's
You think it
gonna,
will?
it's gonna happen.
happen, yeah.
It won't happen at Yale, but it's gonna happen in many places, just because the economics of having a 400-person class for.
Great moneymaker for the universities.
Right, a 400-person classroom with, a tenured line or tenure track professor teaching them, and everybody has that. It's a very expensive way. And people
Yeah.
can't afford it.
Right.
People are going to colleges, not going to be able to afford it. I thought at Purdue School that we were already right on the edge of pricing ourselves out of being, because New York's extremely expensive for people to come here
Yeah.
and teach here. It's expensive for paying the faculty. What saved our boat was always the foreign students. So we had probably 35% non-US or 40% non-US students in the whole university. And we gave some financial aid, they tended to pay more like we paid it for free. So. Interesting.
All right, well, thank you very much. You guys are welcome to chat. I'm gonna say goodnight to everybody online. And we'll let you know.